Welcome back to Pursuing Justice. I'm Harriet Hendel. With me today are two guests who joined me last time to discuss their nonprofit organization called Healing Justice, a national organization that serves individuals who have experienced trauma and inequity in our justice system. Using restorative justice, they provide post-trial support and recovery to crime victims, survivors, and their families. It's good to have you with us again, Jennifer and Katie. Welcome.
Thank you.
Today, we are continuing the discussion and talk about the wide impact of wrongful conviction as it affects a family and how healing justice was created. But today, we'd like to begin with you, Katie, and tell us your story.
Absolutely, and thank you, Harriet. It's so important, as you know well, the focus of these cases, and rightly so, has historically been on the individuals who were wrongly convicted and exonerated, and we've forgotten about the rest of the individuals who are impacted and their families and their communities. So Jennifer and I are really grateful for this opportunity to share what we experienced individually or personally, and also the work that we're doing to raise awareness about this piece of these cases. As you noted, I do have a personal connection with a wrongful conviction, and that is that my mother is an exonerated individual from Virginia. It is an old case, like Jennifer's an old case. It was way back when I was just out of law school. I hadn't been out of law school even a year. And my mother's longtime partner, who was essentially my stepfather, died of suicide. He died unexpectedly of a single gunshot wound to the head in his own in his own house with his own gun. And despite our shock over his death, we did accept it as a suicide, as did the rest of our family and our friends. There was no reason to suspect any kind of foul play, not only because of the nature of the death, but also he had been struggling for a very, very long time with significant personal issues and with mental health crises as well. And so for us, it was a personal tragedy, and we tried to put our lives back together. They had been together for about 13 years, and so he was a significant member of our family at the time. And it was also in the wake of my mother's own father committing suicide a few decades earlier. So at the time, there was a lot of support that my mom needed, having experienced now these two suicides of people very close to her, people that she cherished. Right. Unknown to us, truly until many, many, many years later, the police who actually came to the scene and investigated confirmed that the death was a suicide. They used gunshot residue tests to determine that my mother's partner, Roger was his name, had indeed fired the shot that killed him. And then both the local and state medical examiners had determined that the death was a suicide as well. The local medical examiner who came to the scene, and then, of course, the state medical examiner that conducted the autopsy. But these were things that we weren't privy to. And despite this forensic confirmation of suicide, there was a state police investigator who essentially injected himself into the case really within a matter of days. And based on notes that we would see many years later, he decided that the case would be a homicide, and he decided that my mom must be responsible. And his goal was to manipulate out of her a statement that he called tantamount to a confession. And I don't know that we'll ever know why he set about this course, but it really ended up being the whole of his investigation. There was no interviewing of key witnesses, about no confirming of my mom's whereabouts on the night of the death, no waiting for these forensic test results that ultimately proved suicide. What the investigation amounted to was a long, unrecorded interview of my mother just a couple of weeks after the death, where he tried to convince her that her memories of her last evening with Roger were incorrect, and that what had actually happened is that she had fallen asleep in the room where Roger had killed himself and awoken to it, and then suppressed a memory of it out of trauma. And none of this interview was recorded, but at the very end of the day, it was an all-day event, the investigator did turn on the tape recording, and you can hear my mom, she's just devastated. And of course, she has no memory. Her last memories were of saying goodbye to Roger and then going to the grocery store and driving home and seeing my brother. But the police officer was insistent that hadn't happened. And he even ended up sending her to psychotherapy in an effort to uncover these lost memories. And of course, it was confirmed that she had no lost memories, but none of that really mattered. The state, the investigator and the state were really intent on going to trial, and she ended up being charged with first-degree murder and going to trial in Virginia. And there are, of course, many details to the case. I think some of the important things to note was that this investigator really was acting on his own. And later, when he was asked about his interactions with my mother, he really bragged about the fact that she was very naive and didn't realize what was going on, and that she fell for this ruse, and that she should have gotten an attorney and didn't realize that she did, and that he had really kind of bagged an innocent person, if you will. And later, when he was challenged again, he said, well, either she's guilty or she's just really stupid. And my mother was, a very law-abiding, conservative person. She was in her 50s. She had a career. She was, taking care of myself and my siblings, and really she had no idea what was going on. She just did not see what was happening, and I think really for a while there even was questioning her own memory until, of course, it became clear that her memory was correct and that she hadn't been with Roger when he killed himself. But at any rate, it did go to trial, and at trial, the state presented a theory of homicide. There was no mention of the gunshot residue tests or the medical examiner's reports. All of that we would find later, and the argument was that during those hours of interview, when the tape recorder was off, my mom had remembered being present for the suicide, and that was considered to be a confession of sorts, even though later it was clear that she had no memory of that. And there were witnesses who came forward, of course, and corroborated my mom's account, and we had our own forensic experts. But in the end, she was convicted, and she was sentenced to 22 years in prison on a first-degree murder charge. My own personal story beyond that is that we really didn't know where to turn after that, and it fell to me and my siblings and our family and our friends to really put together the dream team that would ultimately free my mom. I think we thought at first that the court would correct it itself, and that did not happen. And so I ended up leaving. My first job out of law school was with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. I left, and I put together a hodgepodge investigative and legal team of family members and friends and neighbors, a few friends from law school, and we ended up going back and conducting the investigation that led to the evidence that later proved that it was a suicide. We discovered the forensic experts and the gunshot residue results and the medical examiner's reports and other evidence of suicide, as well as a variety of other things, key witness reports that disputed testimony that the prosecution witnesses had given. And we were able to go back into federal court and demonstrate that the state had suppressed an abundance of evidence that demonstrated that my mom was innocent, and we won. And the court overturned the case on what we call Brady grounds, on prosecutorial conduct grounds. And the quote from the court was that the case was a monument to prosecutorial mishandling and indiscretion. And in addition to that, the court confirmed that my mom had an unrefuted alibi for the time of the death, and that the state's forensic case was manipulated because it was contrary, of course, to the gunshot residue test results that confirmed the death was a suicide. And from beginning to end, it took 12 years from the time that she was charged until she was freed. And I spent about 10 of those working full-time on her case.
Full-time. Can you very briefly explain, I think I've probably brought it up before, what that Brady rule is, because it was such a key part of the case you described?
It was the key. And frankly, it's a really important element in many cases of wrongful conviction and innocence. It is where state officials, whether it's prosecutors, police, forensic officials, really anyone on the state prosecuting team fails for any reason, even if it's just simply because the evidence is unknown to them, they fail to turn over evidence that would support the defendant's claim of innocence. And so it's an important legal opportunity because, one, of course, it demands accountability from prosecuting officials to make sure that they've gone back and seen everything that the police and the forensic officials have gathered, and that they've turned that over. And if that doesn't happen, then it is an opportunity for an innocent person to get back into court, because you are required to present new evidence when you go back into court. I think there's and I don't want to get too far off into the legal aspect of this, but I do think people believe that, once you're convicted, the issue of guilt or innocence can be relitigated, and it can't. Once you've been convicted, you are seen as a guilty person. And so unless you find something entirely new, something that you couldn't find before, you cannot get back into court on a claim of innocence. And so the Brady rule is a very important one.
Yes, it is. Wow. Now, the impact of what happened to your mother on your family, what was that like?
It is hard to describe, of course. Jennifer describes a black hole. I think that is a very good way of putting it. I don't think that most innocent people and their families ever imagine that this will happen, and they don't see it coming. You watch, movies where you see people, believing that if they're innocent, well, then they'll be acquitted, right? Or they won't even be charged, right? And I remember my mom describes a lot of that, and certainly my family felt it as well. I think I might have been the only one in the family. I had clerked for a judge right out of law school, or begun clerking for a judge. And I think I was probably the only one in my family that realized that you could be convicted even if you weren't guilty. I didn't want to dwell on that, of course, or, cause my family further anguish by sharing that. But innocent people and their families believe that justice will prevail and that their innocence will be seen and confirmed. And so it does feel like falling off into a black hole. And of course, you're rendered voiceless, right? Because the story that is told in court is never the story of what you know to be true. And you aren't permitted to speak up, right? Really, no one wants to hear the truth. And so you sit and watch this go on.